So, in Britain today, it's still illegal to possess and supply many illicit drugs, such as marijuana, which will be the focus of today's episode. Even though it's still illegal, there is a growing culture, particularly among the nation's youth, towards changing this attitude and seeing it as more of an individual's choice and something they should be left alone to indulge in. We're moving from being a society that notices the damages that drugs can do to an individual and also to their wider community, and deciding that we want to inhibit it, to being a society that emphasizes the individual's choice above all things and wants to leave the individual alone to make a decision for themselves. I want to push back against this because I think that it is immoral, and I think that we will make a mistake if we go forward with legalizing and decriminalizing drugs, particularly marijuana. In order to make this case, though, I have to explain why I think so. And to do that, I have to go back in time to a Roman orator, lawyer, warrior, and statesman called Cicero. He's gone down in human history because his defense speeches and political speeches in the Roman Senate are basically some of the best speeches ever given. And he is kind of the bedrock of how to give a speech in Western society. But that's not why I'm interested in him. He wrote a political thesis called The Republic and the Laws. And in it, he noticed that human reason is what ultimately separates us from the animal kingdom around us. Our ability to calculate and to think in advance and step back from our own behavior and make different decisions from just satiating our desires is what makes us unique in the animal world. If you take, for example, a sheep in a farm, if you were to walk up to a farm and watch a sheep for a while, you would notice that sheep don't sit or stand in a field and think about the nature of what it is to be a sheep. They don't question whether they should eat the grass or drink from the stream or lie down and sleep on the grass. They just do it because they're sheep and they're operating on impulse and desire. They don't have the ability to calculate and to equivocate on the nature of existence. Human beings do, though, because we're different. We're not the same as the animals. We've been given a gift that elevates us to the position where we can make reasoned decisions that depart from our desires and our emotions and allow us to make decisions that are moral and in the interests of the common people. And so that is part of our nature. Our ability to reason is a unique part of our nature. It's special. And so anything that threatens that reasoning capability should be treated with the utmost caution and probably initially with contempt. Anything that changes our nature in the short term or in the long run is something that we should be careful with. It's not something we should just dive in straight away and just start experimenting with willy-nilly. What are drugs, and particularly marijuana, if not in this category? In the short term, marijuana can make you intensely paranoid. It can elevate the emotion of paranoia and swamp your mind and make you feel like you have reason to be extremely paranoid, even though the trigger is not real. We can also become intensely hungry or just start laughing uncontrollably. On the drug marijuana, in the short term, we are not capable of reasoning completely effectively. It inhibits our ability to reason. And so in the short term, on a drug like marijuana, you could make decisions that are not in your interest or the interest of others because you have impaired your natural ability to think properly. The same is true in the long run. We don't really know for sure what the long-term implications are. But if you carry on taking a drug like marijuana daily or weekly for years and years at a time, how do you know what the long-term implications are going to be? We don't, but we have evidence coming through that shows a strong link to particularly schizophrenia and also psychosis. So the question you have to answer if you're debating drug use, and particularly marijuana use, is why would you roll the dice with your mind and with your unique ability to reason, which is what separates you from being an animal? Why would you roll the dice with that? That is your greatest tool. It's the thing that makes you who you are. It gives you your nature. This is added to as well when we think about our other gifts as humans. If you think about you or anybody you know, you'll know people who are extremely witty, or people who can calculate things extremely quickly, people who can take things apart and rebuild them without really having any guidance, people who can write really effectively, people who are just great with other people. We all have different gifts and capabilities. And whilst we're on a drug like marijuana, those gifts, which are tied to our reason in some sense, aren't coming to the fore. Because if you're on marijuana constantly and you're dulling your brain and your ability to reason, how can you calculate things properly, or how can you build anything? You can't, because you're in a doped up, drugged up state. It inhibits your ability to utilize these gifts for the betterment of yourself and other people around you. So it has a cost. It has a cost to the people around you now, and you now, but also you in the long run, because it stops you from over time being able to utilize those gifts to build something bigger than what you have now. And so the use of marijuana isn't just something that doesn't come at a cost. It has a very real cost to you, both the you now and the you in the future. And so you should think about it in that way before you decide to get on the drug. Is at what cost will this come to? And is it really worth it? And at what cost to your gifts and to the wider community who might rely on you in the future? There's another reason as well that marijuana use is particularly troubling, and the current cultural move towards normalizing marijuana use. And it's troubling because if you've ever met somebody who's on marijuana, they will become quite obsessed with the drug. They start to know everything about how to grow it. They know all the different strains of plants. They know all the different ways to roll a spliff or a joint. And they will sit and tell you for 45 minutes about all the different strains, as long as you will listen. I've had this myself. I've experienced this recently with a marijuana user who sat with me and just talked endlessly about it, because it became an obsession for them. And so what this obsession, I think, is a kind of ritualistic slavishness to the drug. I think that human beings have an innate desire to dedicate themselves to something noble, to something high and good, a goal that would give their life purpose and meaning. And I think what marijuana users are doing is they are misplacing this desire to worship and aim at something good, and they are putting it into marijuana, which is something lowly, really, and something that won't give you anything good in the long run. It's evil, frankly. So by doing this, by placing this worship and this desire to aim towards something greater into a drug like marijuana, which also has the effect of dulling their minds and their reason, they're effectively enslaving themselves to the drug, which is detrimental to them and everybody else around them. And this is why I want to push back on it's just an individual choice narrative when it comes to people using marijuana. Marijuana users are not free. They are enslaved to a ritualistic habit and worship of a drug that is detrimental to their long-term and short-term capacity as a human being. It isn't a costless free choice for an individual. It has a social and individual cost to the drug. And this, what could this be if this devotion was placed instead in something that actually was noble? What if the person who took their marijuana money went and spent it instead on cultivating a skill like engineering or anything really that would bring forth fruit that was good for people around them and built up a better society around them? We don't know the costs of what we're going to do when we start taking marijuana, and that's evident from what I'm saying. And this is where we really get into dealership of drugs. This is what I've not explained so far and kind of mentioned, is there's another there's another element of the drug cycle that must be explained, and that's drug dealership. Because you and I, if we were to see a person who should be a person who is right ordered and stood up straight and working decently in the community to utilize their natural gifts and to cultivate their reason for the common good. If we see a person who should be doing that and they're instead taking drugs and misusing and their natural abilities and placing it into something that's not positive, and they're worshipping something that will make them a slave, we would speak out against it. We would counsel them not to do this. They would still have the free choice to go and do it. We wouldn't force them, but we would counsel them not to do it. A drug dealer would look at that situation and say, here is somebody whom I can make a profit from. They would see this person as someone who they could take advantage of. What is that if not a vampiric relationship? What are drug dealers if not vampires? You have people who are looking to leech off the weak and take advantage of them in a poor state instead of helping them. It's intrinsically evil and negative to be a drug dealer, and it will bring social implications. It doesn't just impact the drug user. The drug dealer, by engaging in this evil, distorts themselves. They drag themselves down and their character by engaging in this evil and taking advantage of some of them, and it will change and corrupt and distort their character so that everyone around them who knows and loves them, the drug dealer, will also suffer because that person will become more evil as a character. And what is the end result of all of this? The community at large suffers because the drug dealer isn't who he should be, and the drug user isn't who they should be either. They're both people locked in this kind of vampiric, evil cycle in which somebody who's extremely weak is being taken advantage of as somebody who isn't strong enough to rise above evil. And it robs the community of the people that they could have been as good-natured individuals who contribute in a decent way to their local community and families. And so the idea that it is just an individual choice and that it only has individual implications is just completely wrong. It couldn't be further from the truth. Drug use and drug dealership have social costs and social implications, and you can't run away from that fact. To claim that it is just an individual choice and that we should make it just an individual choice is to ignore the reality of the drug landscape. And that's why we shouldn't tolerate it in this society, and it should stay illegal, because it's an evil practice that involves the vampiric taking advantage of weak people by somebody who cannot themselves act well. That's not good by nature, and it doesn't add goodness to our society, so it should be prohibited. Which brings me on to the claim of legalizers, which is that if we did legalize the drug, this would just solve the problem. It would get rid of the illicit gangs. The state would move in to legalize the drug and then would then just place the production of marijuana into the hands of private corporations. The folly in this way of thinking is that you just replace the vampire in the scenario. You do get rid of the illicit gangs potentially, but you just put a private corporation in its place. You don't break the drug cycle and the drug relationship between the vampire and the weak user. You just replace the vampire. And not only do you replace the vampire, you also replace it with a global corporation with global marketing reach, global transportation reach, and global production capabilities. You take it away from an illegal gang that has to operate to some extent under the radar, and so mostly will only do so locally. And you replace it with a company that has global reach that can do so completely openly, and which can then cultivate its and progress its business ties over decades to become way more advanced and entrenched in the society than an illicit gang could ever do. how does that benefit anybody in the community in which we live in? You'll end up with a scenario where private corporations end up making a lot of money off the back of poor and weak individuals who can't stop using drugs. And this will increase the inequality and wealth in society that is already debated and evident in Western societies. You have a massive gap between the richest and the poorest in our society. And what will drug legalization do if not just exacerbate and grow that division? Because you'll end up with corporate owners and corporate shareholders who are intensely rich and who can control their emotions and desires because they are industrious people who have proven themselves to be able to control desires and work at a long-term project. They will then be profiteering from people low down on the social scale who are struggling and who can't control their desire when it comes to drugs. That can't be a good scenario for anybody, particularly if you claim to be left-wing and to care about the common man. How is it that you would support the capitalization of drugs by corporate entities who would then profiteer from it? That doesn't make any sense to me. But there's a problem from another angle, is that it would also corrupt what the state is. So in the prior situation where drugs are illegal, the state is a guardian of the people. It is there to stop the exploitation of the drug user by the drug dealer by enforcing a law against it and using its police force to go out and marshal this and stop it from happening. So the government in that situation sees itself as an entity that is there to protect the weak in society and to look after people in society in general and put forth a moral judgment and exercise it in a way that is good. If they were to legalize drugs, they would go from being the guardian to being complicit in the sale of the drug by the vampiric organizations who would do it. That would fundamentally corrupt the nature of government. It would go from being the guardian of the people to being people who cooperate in the advantage taking of the lowest of the low in the society. Your government would no longer be able to be trusted because they wouldn't be acting on the interests of society as a whole, but only on the interests of the people who are making profit from this enterprise. That should be unpalatable to anybody with any moral impulse and anybody who has designs to want to live in a successful social sphere. We cannot allow the state to become ruthless exploiters of the people. They must act on the interests of the many. And an example springs to my mind. In the UK, there was a doctor called Harold Shipman. And Harold Shipman was found many decades after he'd began his career as a doctor to have been murdering his patients, mostly elderly people. And he was brought to trial, found guilty of many, many murders. I think I'm right in saying that he's the biggest mass murderer in England. And he then killed himself by hanging in his cell. The reason why Harold Shipman's murders shocked the British public so much was not just the fact that he murdered. That in itself is brutal and evil. And it was disgusting to the British populace that it was allowed to have happened. And he'd done it. But what added to it was the fact that he was a doctor. And it is a doctor's purpose to heal people, to look after them as good shepherds, and to seek to improve their health and nurture them back to life. Harold Shipman inverted and corrupted that institution by making himself a doctor of death. He did the opposite of what he was supposed to be doing in a position of care, entrusted in a position of care. And that's what made his actions more evil and more malicious than what they would have been instead. And so when we think about the corruption of an institution like a doctor by Harold Shipman, what would the government not be if not a corrupted institution, if it goes from being the guardians of the people to ruthless exploiters? Do we want to really do this and to roll the dice on where that goes and see what happens? Because it's not easy once that you've done that to reverse it and go back to a society where the government is now guardians of the people again. Once you have made a change, the ripple impact goes out, and it's not easy to roll back. It wouldn't be impossible, but it's very difficult. And so it's better to just not take that step in the first place and to stick with what we have, which is a society that has moral judgments and that expects the government to look after them in some fashion and keeps drug use illicit. And I think this ultimately is what the crux of the argument boils down to, is that we don't want a society where the strong are allowed to take advantage of the weak. We want a society that tries to rescue the weak and gives them an opportunity to rise up again and to move away from their existing position of degradation. And that's the kind of society that we want to pass on to our children. We want to be able to look at our children and say, look, we tried to act in the interests of the good and the moral, and we tried to stick up for people who are not doing as well in society and offer them a ladder to get up and to move away from practices that are destroying them and their local communities and their families. We don't want to be a society that turns around to our children and says, yes, we just allowed drug use because we decided that we couldn't be bothered to take the moral path anymore. And we decided that it would just be easier for us if we allowed companies to profiteer from it, and we turned the government into their accomplices. And you have now inherited the society where there are a lot of people walking around who are damaged by normalized drug use, and that's not an easy problem to extricate yourself from. Good luck. I don't think we want to go down that path. And I think if you sit and seriously consider, as a youth in Britain today, if you sit and seriously consider this topic and really think about what the implications of it are and what it would be, you would come to the same conclusions as what I have just said. And this is also, to finish, a message to existing drug users. I say all this not to pour scorn upon you. I say it because I want you to amend your ways and be better, because I think that you are worth more than what drug use would indicate of you. I think marijuana use and drug use more widely are beneath you, and that you can rise above it and do better for yourselves and contribute to your local community. And I sincerely hope that you manage to come off the drug